Welcome everybody to the Existentialist Society in Melbourne, Australia. I'm David Miller. I'm the Society's secretary. Existentialism is an umbrella term covering diverse and often conflicting schools of thought. Consequently, we are not agreed on who or what is an existentialist. We simply agree to disagree. Our speaker today is Dr. Pierre van Osselaer, and his topic is the existential value of complexity. Pierre.
Hello, everyone. So, yes, my name is Pierre. I did my PhD research in semiotics and complexity, and my thesis is actually an interactive one. I had to rewrite it to get it online because the database is too difficult to put online, but the thesis itself, the text, is available online, and it's called Complexia. And what I'm doing in there is actually demonstrating by giving people the opportunity to navigate that sense is created by the reader with the opportunity that we have to provide tools for readers to use. And that's what I'm going to do today as well in the context of the existential value of complexity. So I'm going to share my screen. The session will be in 3 segments. The first segment, I'm going to go through some PowerPoint slides, which I will make available as well. The second part is a little bit of a database with quotes, and that is random. And during that session, because the quotes are at random, you can then intervene as well. And then the third part of the session is a question and answer, where we can discuss what has happened and what you think about it. So I'm going to share my screen now for the first part. So I hope that you all can see this, the existential value of complexity, and of course we know the dates. Right. So existential parking. I suspect that some of you may have seen that. You know? And I'm not going to read the slides, by the way. And you, as I said, you will have access to them. So, quote, you probably know that when we teach at university, we're supposed to have those presentations where we say to people, well, you know, health and safety, you know, be careful. You know, if there's a fire, what are you going to do? Jump through the hoops. At times, this is a time. The time is different depending on where you are. And tea and coffee facilities, I hope that you all have that because this is going to go on for about 2 hours. So to lead in to, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Santa Fe. Again, I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to give an opinion as to how important that is. You may notice already a link to something that is very popular in existentialism, and that's the concept of the group, crowd. Santa Fe Institute is interesting, is that it is an institute that is only for postdoc research. And it's an institute that doesn't focus on complexity as a topic, but as a means to interpret various topics in various disciplines. So it's totally multidisciplinary. It's a bit like everyday life. So it covers everything that we've got in everyday life. And people that do research do not stick to their discipline. They all think together in the context of the theories of complexity. Each one of them is going to have a certain approach to complexity as well. Some people that work in complexity do it from a very mathematical point of view, and that is very closely linked to the theory of chaos. And some of them look at it more from a philosophical point of view, and the fact that there is uncertainty in the way that things happen. one of the things that I find interesting is that whatever research we do, we are actually what we do is we get the material from wherever we can find it. And just before the meeting today, there was already a discussion about the everyday, what happens in the everyday. What most people think is that when you do research, you need to have a purpose and a plan. One of the problems with that, from both the existentialist point of view and from the complexity point of view, is that we're never fully in control, so that we can make sense of everything. It is part of the crowd, it's part of the horde. And in the context of today's technology, it's part of all the information that we can get, particularly with the internet, like what we are doing today. We're not even in the same room. We do not even have to be in the same city, not in the same country, and for the moment on the same planet, probably. But that is not necessarily going to be the case for always either. Communication still exists, and the concept that is, I think, critical in there is a concept that we'll come back to as well. That is the concept that we can always make meaning of whatever we come across. And you're going to notice some of the key words like crowd, herd, humanity, inauthenticity, which also means authenticity as well, and the concepts of freedom and anxiety. When we go then to complexity, I already mentioned that complexity is associated with the theory of chaos. What I find interesting is that we go back historically as to where chaos comes from as a concept. When you ask most people about history and mythology, and particularly the mythology of the Greeks, and you ask what was the first entity in Greek mythology, most people come up with the gods that they created. But actually, the Greeks start their philosophy from the concept of chaos. That means from something that is wide open. And I think that is something that is very significant in the context of complexity and the context of existentialism. And I think it's part of the existential value of complexity, is to recognize that it is wide open. However, wide open, like the abyss, chasm, gap, and the void, are not simply something that is open to everything and without limit. That is a different thing altogether. The fact to be open can be open within certain limits, and we'll come back to that as well. It's a question concerning being. That's really what we're talking. So when you look at definitions of existentialism, including the mistakes in the titles, existentialism, a philosophical theory. And then it's interesting because when you talk to people, as Neville mentioned earlier before the meeting, you ask them about philosophy. Some people say, oh, philosophy, I'm not interested in philosophy. Philosophy is not of concern to me. The issue is that whatever happens in our environment is of concern to us. We may not simply recognize it. Existentialism is part of what gives us an idea as the fact that when we exist within something that tells us that we exist, which is actually one of the ideas of Heidegger with Dasein. Once we are in that context, everything that is around us gives us an indication as to how we exist and what existence is about. But we can only do that because we are already there. What we're talking about is conventionally grouped things. And existentialism is questionable, as David already mentioned. And it's one of the points that Jean-Paul Sartre makes, where he said, existentialism is a humanism, but he also says, existentialism, I don't know what it is. Which is interesting because he gives a definition in one presentation, but at the same time, in another presentation, he says, I don't know what it is. What actually happens is that, again, there is a creation of a limit within which everything is open. there is uncertainty. But there is one thing that both complexity and existentialism rely upon, and that is existence. And existence can only happen if there is action. Because if there is no action, there is no perception. And that is a concept that is associated with semiotics, which is my area, and we can go back to that as well. I already mentioned Heidegger. It's interesting to see that Heidegger and Sartre completely disagree on most points. And very often you're going to find people who say, well, Heidegger is not an existentialist, which is something that Sartre actually argued as well. At the same time, it's very difficult to consider existentialism without considering Heidegger, because a lot of what he states is going to impact on the various schools of existentialism that happened after him, and it's going to impact on philosophies that are closely or loosely associated with existentialism, including all the French philosophies of the 20th century, late 20th century, including, of course, Foucault, Derrida, Cixous, and the like. One of the points that is important there is in the context of existence, anxiety, and the crowd, which are concepts that were very closely represented in the work of Heidegger as well. Existence, of course, a sign, anxiety, uncertainty. In particular, if you look at works like the questioning concerning technology, where he looks at uncertainty whenever we do something, because we use tools and we use it in the context of the society, in the context of the crowd, and we are never in full control of the causes. Because what eventuates is chaos and complexity. There is something that is very significant here. When we look at the concept of Dasein, we look also at the concept of immanence. And that is also interesting because when I was looking at some of the points that are available on the web, Kierkegaard, fundamental truth, existence are not representations. At the same time, whenever we make sense because of the signs that we perceive. So we make sense through representations. The existence is not the representations that we use to make sense of it, which is an interesting conundrum. To propose that existence is simple is an idea. And that is where we come to the concept of complexity as different to the concept of complication and complication. Things that are simple are things that are predictable. A line. Complexity is simply multiple systems that are simple, that overlap and interact all the time. So we've got multiple inputs that interact with each other and interact with what is already there. And so there is something there that tells us that we must recognize the fact that we exist in something that is like nature, that is changing all the time, and that is the essence of existence. That transformation is the essence of existence. One thing that I found that I thought was interesting in the context of what we're talking about in regards to complexity and existentialism is that if you do research on existentialism and complexity, you're coming across all sorts of things that are very much associated with the everyday. One of them, which I found interesting, and that's simply my personal opinion, and we can talk about how relevant that is Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl is a psychiatrist. To put you in context, and I don't think it's mentioned in the slides, he was captured by the German army and put in a concentration camp because he was Jewish. But when he came out later, he developed a theory that everything that we live gives us an opportunity to construct meaning. And so he came up with something that is a very positive approach whatever happened in existence, which in a way is a contradiction with people like Sartre, who says l'enfer, c'est les autres. Other is the devil, it's hell, which is interesting actually, because translating the sentence of Sartre, l'enfer, c'est les autres, is not an easy thing to do, simply because l'enfer, c'est les autres is not just saying the others are hell, but other is hell. That means a certain difficulty of reconciling ourselves with that which is different. Whereas what Frankl argues is that no matter how different the situations can be, no matter how unexpected, no matter how difficult, we can always make sense of it. And when we make sense of it, we've got that freedom of attitudinal choice. That is directly associated with complexity, which is how I came across Frankl. So, as I mentioned already, Frankl himself, suffered persecution and brutality, then turned that around by making sense of it. Existential philosophy guide are like that with illustration. So you are here for no apparent reason at all. And that is something that is very closely associated to the concept of complexity. No matter where we are, because complex systems change all the time, we find ourselves in situations where we know where we're coming from. We've got an idea that we're going in a certain direction. We're never sure where we are and where we are going, except that we always know that we're going somewhere, just as we know that we can make sense of where we were. It's all the meaning of labels. One of the ideas that I particularly like in existentialism is the concept of absurdity, which actually is associated with complexity as well, because complexity is about things that are not controllable. So to the outside, they look like absurd. Why is that there at all? Because we're not in control. So there is a kind of an assumption that because we're not in control, that it doesn't make sense. But that is not absurdity as it is conceived from an existential point of view. It's simply that we don't know where we're coming from. We don't know where we're going. We don't even know why we're here in the first place. And we don't even know if that is a reality, not except that we make sense of it through the signs of our existence, and also to the concept of semiotics. What this is then also a description. What I'm providing here is a few tools of description of things that are associated with complexity and existentialism. It's not an explanation of either. It's not an explanation either of how they interact. Kind of description is a kind of a message to say, let us see how that progresses and how that happens, because it is in how it happens that existence is. So within the limits, one of the things that we need to know is that whatever happens, and people who are not familiar with chaos theory, you may be familiar with the concept of a butterfly effect, all sorts of graphs as well. Whenever you send the pendulum moving, and the pendulum keeps on moving, the pendulum is going into all sorts of directions depending on very small inputs. But it never goes beyond a certain limit. Now that is very much what we're talking about. Existence is within a chaotic state of equilibrium. It cycles within certain limits. The issue there is that the limits are not absolute either. And that is we're coming back to concepts that were proposed by people like Charles Sanders Peirce, and concepts that are proposed by Derrida as well. The concept of limits implies also concepts of something that is within. Within that, one of the interesting things with complexity theory is that we are talking about a certain teleological approach to reality. There is a telos. There is something that is a kind of an implied, not exactly purpose, something that is in the future. From a complexity point of view, that telos is an attractor. Then the question is there one? Well, obviously there is not just one, because we are not there yet. So there are a multiplicity of attractors that work to what we want to have an impact upon now, with the concept of that which is going to be later. And that is where we come close again to Heidegger and the concept of causality. Martin Heidegger, Arendt, and Marcel, they look at movements. They look at things that are almost like machine-like functions. But at the same time, it's cogs in a system that is dynamic. Complexity is the study of dynamic systems. That means systems where there are multiple inputs, that each of the input is an impact on the output, then is an input into the further outputs as well. And there is an unavoidable uncertainty within the limits. So self-organization is when a system attains a state of explosive instability. It produces self-organization. That instability, which is the essence of complex dynamic systems, is something that actually causes things to happen just as much as what we do causes things to happen. We are part of that uncertainty. One of the points that I would like to make in the context of this slide, in the context of the presentation in general, is that you may have noticed that I talked about a psychiatrist. Now we're talking about Prigogine and Stengers. Prigogine and Stengers are mathematicians. Prigogine got the Nobel Prize for Physics for his research in chemistry. One of the things that is interesting with complexity, as in the context of the Santa Fe Institute, is that dynamic systems exist in everything. They are actually unavoidable because there is never a single system where there's only one input. And as soon as we've got multiple inputs, we've got a dynamic system, which is one of the theories proposed by Prigogine and Stengers. Stengers was teaching, and Prigogine were teaching at the University Libre de Bruxelles. And they are essentially mathematicians, and physicists and chemists. One of the things with static equilibrium is that the concept of dissipative structures, the concept of energy, and the concept of the fact that anything that is energy also little change to change it, fluctuations and variations, and the spontaneity from one attractor to another. Now, as I already mentioned, there is a kind of a concept that you need one attractor, but in fact, systems have multiple attractors, which actually causes them to have that kind of ongoing transformation. The ethics of ambiguity, Beauvoir, offers a picture of human subject as constantly oscillating. And that again is that kind of attractors. And the fact that when we come close to one attractor, the other attractor becomes a kind of a deviation, creates that deviation, creates the movement. And there is an antithetical movements all the time. Now, she argues that the subject must produce an ethics which will be continuous with its ontological core. And that, I think, is very interesting in the context, both existentialism and complexity. Complex system, no matter how often it deviates, exists around the practice. It's something that is a continuous movement, something that is almost predictable, but only statistically predictable. I argue that the same thing is happening with existence in general, and that it is got an ontological core, continuity. Within that continuity, things are not always the same. And that is where the concept of continuation and discontinuation comes in. Discontinuation does not mean a transformation of existence as ontological core, but a transformation of existence as action and representations of the actions. Process. So back to Heidegger. And it's interesting to look at that in the context of the history of philosophy. And that is what I would recommend you to do. And by the way, when you get the slides, you will have the references as well. So you can do some further research. Western metaphysics, positing of the forgotten question of being. That is what Heidegger goes back to, which is, of course, essentially existential, which is, of course, where he then comes up with the concept of Dasein. It's a relationship past philosophies. And at the same time, there is something that is critical, in that it is, he is indebted to the previous philosophers, just as we are indebted to all those people that came before. Famous saying, of course, we stand on the shoulders of giants. It doesn't matter on what shoulders we stand, it is something that we bring into our everyday, something that was already there. And so what we do is we bring from the past into the present something that we use for the purpose of something that is not there yet. In the second part of the presentation, we may be lucky, no? And if we are lucky, we're going to come across the famous four causes. If not, you will get access to those as well. And for those who are not familiar with it, certainly I would recommend that you look at the four causes and how Heidegger then talks about them and how it indicates something about uncertainty and the fact that existence is unavoidable, but unpredictable in its detail. And at the same time, we need to look, of course, at genealogy as part of causality. Teleological attractors shape our actions today with the tool available, traces of the past, but it is the future that calls. Nobody does something in order to change the past. Do things in order to have a certain idea of the future, a certain creation of the future. We can only do that today using the past, which I find rather interesting. Telos is what drives us. We and the material that we've got today are there as kind of agents using the past in order to try to get that telos, which we'll never achieve, and at the same time creates that which is. So there is an ambiguity within the limits, but there is something that is equivocal. And that equivocality, the fact that there is a question all the time, there is always that doubtful nature, that doubtful character, that doubtful thing that leads us to the questioning, which is actually also what David was referring to in the context of existentialism. There is always a question. The interesting thing is that the question and the ambiguity give us the opportunity to then start asking about how relevant is this? Where can we go? What are the limits? And it has an ethical implication, is that although we are never fully in control, we are nevertheless impacting on that which is going to happen. That means we are always responsible without being in charge. So what I want to do now, because I've been talking for about half an hour, which is definitely more than enough, I'm going to start now a set of quotes, and it's a little bit of a database. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a database engine, and the set of quotes was selected but it was almost selected at random as well on the web, by the way. And some of them were selected as part of the work that I've done. What I would like us to do is to see what happens when we select things at random. And here, I would like David to give people the opportunity to come in, because I'm going to say, I'm not just going to comment on those quotes. I'm going to give people the opportunity, and let me just open that database. It's already open, by the way, that I need. And share my screen again. So now you see a little database, and okay, we are starting. So go. As I mentioned, this is not linear. There are quotes, and they are selected at random by the computer system. The closer we come to danger, the more brightly the ways into the saving power begin to shine, and the more questioning we become. We've talked about questioning. I did not decide to have this quote happening now. So what do you think of that? Anyone?
Yes, I don't believe that is necessarily human nature. I think a lot of people, when they're faced with danger, they retreat into their emotional prejudices and go into an emotional defensive mode as opposed to questioning. And I think you can see a lot of that in the political situation in the US.
Yes, and there is a very interesting thing associated with that. When people say, they try to avoid danger, one of the points, this is actually the final paragraph of the question concerning technology by Heidegger. He comes to this because when he looks at technology, he looks at tools. And he says, no matter what we do, when we use tools, we're never fully in control, which is the concept of different forces. And he said that means no matter what tools we're going to use them for something that we hope is a positive purpose. We can never do away with the danger that the tools involve. So when we invent a car, it gives us the opportunity to go and help people further away. And if we have to walk, we create the danger of the car accident. When we build a bridge, it gives ourselves the opportunity to go from one side of the ravine to the other. The bridge is also a possibility of collapsing. And what Heidegger points out is that no matter what we do, whenever we do something, we change the environment in which the things happen at the same time as providing a tool to have a change happening. And there is always a danger involved. And that danger, as Ronnie mentioned, we need to accept it.
Neville has his hand raised. Go ahead, Neville.
Yes, thanks. Yes, I see this very much in terms of my work on the American revivalist tradition. That certainly you could. I think you got a very apt description there. I think about the way the politics has worked in a couple of centuries of American revivalist tradition, and the word piety links it to the German, links it back to Kant.
Yes, and it's interesting because, of course, Heidegger refers to Kant, and when he looks at the concepts of causality, he goes back to Kant as well. And of course, it also links to the questioning that Kant proposes, particularly in the context of reason and absolute reason. And that is how all those things link. And so what I find really fascinating is that they are actually all linked. They don't exist in isolation. They create that kind of environment in which we can make sense of what is happening.
Dave, but people don't question when they're faced with danger. I mean, there's been research on brain chemistry and behavior subsequent to, Sartre's regime. There's been a lot of research on the brain and brain chemistry, and people do not turn to questioning and rational thought when they're faced with danger.
Look, the history doesn't support that. I mean, this is the thing. I'm very frustrated because I don't think in cultural studies they've really got to the nitty-gritty of the historical interactions between persons and concepts here. So that if you look at evangelicalism, which I extensively and critically look at, that doesn't bear out at all, because, there is nothing static, as Pierre has explained, in systems thought here. We've got to get out of this ideological framing of block, that ideology or systems thought works in blocks and that's the end of the story. No, there is change. There's cultural change. There's social change. There's change within the cognition.
Yeah, there is a point that was raised, and so when you see the slides about Frankl, one of the things that I found interesting about his approach is because of his experience with the concentration camps, the fact that he lost his family there. After the war, he started thinking about that. And his questioning is not so much about the questioning of the danger itself, but the questioning as how do we make sense of the danger and how we make sense of situations that appear to be completely unacceptable. And so there is not only the questioning of the danger, but there is the questioning of how we make sense of the danger and how we make sense of what happens. And that is a very positive attitude, actually. So questioning there becomes then essential. As Heidegger points out, questioning is the piety of thought. And it actually questions the concept of reason as well.
Dave from Tacoma has his hand up.
Yes.
And thank you, sir. I'm interested in this philosophy. I am actually an engineer, but I have great interest in this topic. But I'm analyzing the situation here. Danger. In my everyday life, I know I'm in some dangerous situations, but because I deal with them every day, I know how to deal with them. But to me, danger, I'm in a strange city, late at night, on the wrong side of the tracks, and I'm walking on the sidewalk, and ahead of me is a group of men. I don't know what they might have in mind for me. I don't know if I could walk them safely or not. I'm not interested in saving power. I'm interested in maybe getting the heck out of there, maybe turn around going the other direction, maybe crying for help, maybe looking around, see if there's anybody else that can help me. I'm questioning what to do, but God, we're not interested in saving power. I just put a solar array on my roof. That's saving power, but it isn't. Confronting danger is not. I'm heck with saving power. My comment anyway. Thank you.
Pierre, you wish to respond?
Well, it's interesting because, again, the slides that quotes, I know I've got quotes about something that is the kind of danger that Dave refers to. One of the examples of that is actually in The Voyage to the End of the Night, The Voyage au bout de la nuit by Céline. Céline, of course, was in the First World War. And one of the main passages there in this novel is when he goes to the front and he's there with an officer on a horse and with another soldier, and the Germans are on the end of the road and they start shooting with machine guns. That is danger. And Céline asked the question, said, what is this about? And Céline is very often referred to, particularly Voyage au bout de la nuit, by people like Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Derrida, and they put it as the kind of the pre-existential novels. Now, obviously, Voyage au bout de la nuit was written in 1930, so existentialism was around. But Céline himself doesn't point out that it is an existentialist novel, but a lot of what he refers into there is existentialist. And he goes back to the concept of danger. And he goes and looks at what that really means. And he then makes the point that one of the things that he could do was try to run away. The interesting thing is that what happens is that he doesn't have the time to run away. And he explains in his book, you know, what then that is going to cause as well. So he got wounded in the First World War. And he lived with part of those wounds for the rest of his life. But the thing is that the questioning there is interesting. And one of the points that he makes, and again, it's reason, but at the same time, it's something else. When he then reflects upon that moment, he says, dying is easy for people who have no imagination. Now, that's an interesting point that comes very close to the kind of thinking that Derrida will propose, where he offers a rational argument where it's the emotional that is driving the reason. And that, again, questions the whole thing about the blocks that we were talking about. People tend to think in blocks rather than to open up. And I think that's where complexity theory is quite interesting. It opens up, because it is not fixed on one discipline. It doesn't look, and you're going to have, and it's interesting for the concept, for instance, for Dave, I don't know how familiar Dave is with complexity theory, mathematics, and engineering, but there are engineers working in there as well. And they look at the concept of danger in that context in terms of something that is a predictability, not an absolute. And so that is part of my reaction there. And I know that Derek and a couple of others that hands up, but yes, let's do that. And then I'll change to another quote.
Go ahead, Derek.
Myself, yeah, good. Okay, yeah, I mean, I think what the previous speakers have demonstrated is that the response to danger is contingent. You know, I mean, we have the saying, the prospect of death, you know, concentrates the mind, but it also freezes the mind. You know, so I think we have a contingent statement here, like a possibility in the midst of complexity. Not, I mean, when we see a statement, we want to respond to it in true or false terms. But in the spirit of the conversation, is that the right way to respond to it? You know, we're making one contingent statement in the midst of complexity in context of other statements. Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, okay, so I'll just leave it at that for the moment.
I will leave that open, yes. Let's just go to something else. Again, totally, no. Again, that is not. One of the things that I found interesting as well, so I'm familiar with the work of Derrida. And one thing that he refers to is research calls not only for a different mode of writing, but also for a work of transformation applied to the rhetoric, staging of the particular discursive procedures, which is actually what we're doing here. There is that kind of thing. There is an assumption that we can, when we do a presentation, when we present an argument, that we can guide everything in such a way that it is predictable. Whereas what complexity theory tells us is that there is always an uncertainty, but at the same time, we can always make sense of it. There is nothing that we cannot make sense of after the fact. And it's the point that Frankl makes. He simply makes the point that you can then do that from a positive point of view, positive thinking, That means, look at it as something that is good to you. Whereas people like Sartre and also people like Louis-Ferdinand Osselaer look at that as something where you look back and say, that is terrible, but at the same time, I can make sense of it. So what do people think of that? The fact that we need to change the rhetoric, the fact that we need to change the way that we communicate as well, with an emphasis on openness and trying to get the conversations going, rather than to try to control the conversations.
Neville has his hand raised.
Yes, this is something that I think I struggle with. I think it doesn't provide the clarity I think other philosophers in the past have. But it seems to me in my discourse between what I call scholarly work, which the rhetoric casts as academic, and in the interaction with the other being sort of the populist mindset, with all the prejudices of what is assumed is academic writing or discourse. It for me, yeah, there's a difficulty there. There's a real difficulty there. In my writing, I've been arguing that my thesis in 1995 is Lieben philosophy, life philosophy, and yet it is also an academic thesis. So in some sense, I think it can fall into a false binary, which sets the populist against the academic and the academic against the populist.
Yeah, there is actually something that I really find critical there in the context of the French philosophers of the second part of the 20th century. We see those people as academic writers. But what people tend to forget is that people like Foucault were read as popular writers. So Les Mots et les Choses was actually a top-selling book in France. And when people then consider that, oh, well, it's academic work. Well, no, a lot of people that were not in academia were reading Les Mots et les Choses. The problem that we've got is that when we look at works like, particularly works like Derrida and Cixous, when we look at it from the outside, French society, we are introduced to them through academic circles, whereas the French population were introduced to them as books of every day. And that, I think, is a very important point there. And so it's never one or the other. It is the way that we interpret them in certain contexts, which is actually a point that Derrida makes. And Derrida is very difficult to read in English. Fortunately, I read them in French. It's much easier to read Derrida and Foucault in French than it is to read them, because they manipulate the language in such a way that it makes sense. One of the famous sentences of Derrida is il n'y a pas de texte hors texte, which people have translated in English by saying there is no such a thing as a text outside of the text. That is not at all what Derrida means. Il n'y a pas de texte hors texte is there is no text out of its context, and that we write and we make sense in the context in which we write and in the context in which somebody is going to read it. And so that is something that is very close to what you put out there. That is, the context very often drives the way that people interpret something.
Well, I'd like to say something. I mean, yes, Neville, I agree with you. There's a dichotomy between, the academic world and, the popularization of a lot of concepts. I mean, it happens in philosophy and literature. It happens in technology and science as well. But to me, there's another lacuna, which is more interdisciplinary research more of an interdisciplinary perspective needs to be done before you come up with, an academic thesis. And, to me, this, so far, I just feel like it's an example of that. We're talking about existentialism from, and ideas from 60, 70 years ago. And, there's been a lot of research, there hasn't been any discussion on behavioral determinism, what we're learning about free will, nature versus nurture, a lot of the technology. And if people would in academia would not be so siloed and would be, integrating the latest research in many different fields, well, I don't know, but I think it would be good. I mean, when I read something like the previous slide that says explosive instability produces self-organization, I'm like, you must be mad. Entropy is the second law of thermodynamics. Explosive instability doesn't necessarily self-organize. It's mad. It's simply not true. And the whole behavioral determinism, genetics, conditioning, where's that in a discussion of existentialism, right?
That's my point, Holly. See, obviously, you don't read my works, but if you went to my website, went to my blogs, you find that's exactly what I've been arguing for at least the last 6 years and a half since my wife died. That I have been on this journey, discussing and blogging, but also academic papers, book chapters, and working on towards books with manuscripts on this very issue, which I call comprehensive education, which we did have in our education system, but we've lost that because the whole higher education funding economics got rid of a lot of fields that were demonstrating. I first worked at Griffith University for the Vice Chancellor, Roy Webb, and that's what Griffith University was founded in 1975 in multidisciplinary education. So the philosophy and practice has been there. It's a case that we have lost it because of government policies. And I have been very active in articulating that story, that narrative, and that argument.
Yes, if there I would add to that as well. I'm a great believer in multidisciplinary, which is why I used the first slide of my presentation to talk about the Santa Fe Institute. What is really critical there is that it is not based on disciplines. It's based on people from different disciplines working together. What is interesting is that one of the people that was doing some postdoc research there was Michael Langton. And he wrote about the philosophy in the book on philosophy of artificial life. There's a whole section there about his work and how he looked at flocking and tried to model flocking of birds and fishes. And he was trying to find the rules that govern that. And it's because he was working with people in the Santa Fe Institute that were working in computing, but also in climate change, that suddenly he had the idea that if the birds, the fishes, and even we do it when we drive cars, why are there less accidents? Why are there not more accidents, rather? And why do birds flock without great difficulty and the fish flock without great difficulty? And it suddenly dawned on him, because of climate science and the like, that there must be very simple processes there that are not totally predictable, but that drive the thing in such a way that we avoid critical danger most of it. And then he suddenly realized that we only need 3 fundamental rules. 1, get as close as possible to the other. never come so close that you're going to touch them. And when the one that you are close to changes direction, you change direction with them. And then he put that in a computer program, and suddenly what he invented was a way of modeling natural systems, which were then used by other researchers in the Center for Institute to fine-tune certain research in climate change as well, and in certain economic factors and other issues where people were looking at something that looks totally unpredictable. But at the same time, you can find some very simple steps that then give an idea as to what can happen and how it happens. One of the points, of course, that he makes and that people like Conrad Lawrence made before him is that in terms of climate, for instance, is that we may understand how those processes work, but it's never completely predictable. But it is based also on that concept that why did they manage to get those concepts? Because they were in an interdisciplinary environment. And I struggled with the way that education is going for the moment, where actually we remove the questioning by saying, you need to go in that discipline and there's nothing outside. And there I'm going to refer quickly, without going in all the details, that I was giving a semiotics course at Murdoch University in Perth. And it was a third and postgraduate unit called Reading Image and Text. And it was reputed to be an extremely difficult unit because it went into the details of how the making of sense through science has that unpredictability and raises all sorts of questions about reality and perception. What was interesting is that I had students from every single faculty asking to have that as an option. And so I had always classes of people that were lawyers, engineers, people doing physics, people doing biology, people doing media. That was really very interesting. That was what I liked about something like that, is that it broke down the barriers between disciplines. And then we worked in groups and looked at things. And my challenge was always a bit like with this. I always said, we're not going to predict everything that happens across the weeks. And I said, whenever you come across a problem, bring it to class. Because my point is that if we cannot make sense of something that we didn't know, then we have no right to state that we can make sense of something that we know. And that again is breaking down the barriers between disciplines. Any more on that, or do we want another one? Let's go. Well, talking about somebody that you've got in front of you. So that is part of my work, complexion. It's one of the segments in the thesis. Correlation determines not just the determination of one aspect of a correlation, also determines the other. It is impossible in correlation to change one thing without changing that which is correlated. So both sides of a collision, same limit of interaction, there's mutual inclusion-exclusion at play. Always. So the potential for transgression grows proportionally to the importance of the tension and the narrowness of the interaction. So when we come across situations where there is enormous tension, when points of that tension come very close together, then we've got that kind of correlation that causes things to happen that impact on all the things that are around it, in particular the two things that come close together. And it doesn't have to be two, it can be two or three or four. There are all sorts of interpretations of this, and not just in the context of semiotics and complexity, because it applies to things like politics as well, as an example. Whenever we're in a situation where there is an increase in tension in politics, the closer you bring those tensions together, the more you've got a dynamic system in which the result is going to become unpredictable. And we've seen that in American politics in recent times. We see it also in politics here. And we also see it in education, because there is a tension in between the everyday and the reality of multiplicity and the way that we try to do education, where we say everything is linear. And so we are now in a situation of extreme tension between the idea that we can predict and the fact that reality is unpredictable. And my opinion is that whenever we've got situations like that, you're in correlations that then become so dynamic that there is that kind of trigger that changes something more fundamentally. I think. Again, that's simply a proposed. It's not a fact. So what do people think?
So
Well, that-
what confused? I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Holly. No. Okay, Dave from Tacoma has got his hand raised. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I hate to be so questioning, but reading about a collision determined by the same limit of interaction. Okay, two cars run into each other on the highway or street or whatever. Yeah, to me that's kind of equal. But I'd like to drag you out in the real world again. A couple days ago, an airplane fell out of the sky. I think there were 4 people in it, but just could be by myself. I lose control of my airplane. I fall down and I crash into your house and kill you. I don't think it's mutual inclusion exclusion. To me, that's very much a transgression of one person upon another one. Am I kind of misreading this?
I think you are. When we talk about the collision, it's the point where things come together. It's going by necessity impact all the sides of that which is there at the time. So
Yeah,
when,
and I'm sorry.
yes, Holly. Yeah.
I had a very similar point to the last one made. My attack, though, Dave, was on the narrowness of interaction phase. I mean, you drop a country drops a nuclear bomb on a city and wipes everyone out. That's not narrowness of interaction at all. Anything that's a one-to-many, right?
No. I think you've got it back to front there. The narrowness of the interaction is not the result. It is when the size of the tension increases and the narrowness is limited that suddenly we've got those collisions. So it's not the collision that causes the narrowness of interaction. It's when things are narrow in terms of interaction and there is an enormous tension, then the collision is going to be more significant. So if you drop an atomic bomb in the middle of nowhere, nobody's going to be killed. Right? So there's a lot of tension is only something, a physical event.
Okay, so then the narrowness of interaction would be like a very small set of shared values between the presidents of the countries, or not enough red phone dialogue, too narrow of an interaction.
That could be one. Yes, that could be one.
Okay, got it.
Derek, it's your turn.
Okay, good. I think we're talking about transgression, tension, and interaction in a human context. Yeah, I mean, immediately this poses the context of education, and perhaps business. The idea of disruption, it seems to be a pejorative term for pupils in school, but in business we're thinking about disruption as something positive. This whole transgression, tension, and interaction. I mean, it's different in what I'm saying. It's different in different levels of education and in different cultures. You know, I'm in Singapore at the moment. I've lived here for many years, and you know, they have quite a different, you know, a perspective of what the narrowness of interaction should be to the US. Yeah, okay, I'll leave it at that because Neville has got his hand up.
Yeah, I like to respond, Derek. I mean, I think what you're saying is right, but it seems like there has to be then another step in the process. You can't resign yourself to a cynical sort of position, which could be, for example, egotism. You know, there are different contexts. Some contexts involve the ego or the self. Other contexts are out there with the other. So there's got to be some sort of happiness, a communicative rationality whereby there's a common understanding between these different contexts. So I'm agreeing with you, but I just think that then we have to go a little further to work out what the commutative rationality is in being able to state some commonality between contexts that I'm in and the contexts that others are in.
Yeah, did you want to respond?
No, I find there are a number of very interesting points, and again, you know, I'm interested in that kind of discovery process that we are involved in when we talk about things, and I'm not absolutely sure as to how I would make sense of it, except for a couple of points. One is that the point that Derek makes in regards to business. One of the things is, be it in business or be it in community change, disruption is not, of course, negative or positive, simply disruption. One thing that is associated directly with the point here is that when we are living as people, no matter in what situation we are, there's a difference in between what we call the community and what we call the institution. The community is the informal management that people have by managing themselves within the group. And the group evolves. Naturally, it's a community. The institution is that which it tries to impose a certain stability, because without the institution, we don't know where anything goes. So one of the and whatever situation we are in, imagine the situation of a business. There's the business as an institution, which has rules, regulations, they're written down. We try to abide by them. And then we've got the community of people that live in there. So I was lucky enough to work for several years for KPMG as a management consultant. And at the time, it was very gender biased. And so what we had is all sorts of rules, actually, in terms of presentation, that were beginning to be at odds with, or rather the community of the people working at KPMG was beginning to be at odds with some of the regulations that existed within the organization KPMG. And so what happens is that there is that kind of tension between what the people wanted to achieve and the values that they had, and some of the values and the rules that existed within the organization. Now, over time, that tension increases. That's unavoidable, because it's only when because they're relatively close, but not really close enough in terms of the numbers involved. And suddenly you come to a point where the tension is such that something needs to give. Now, the interesting thing is that the community cannot give. because the community does not have rules. It simply changes. And what happens is that then we've got the disruption of the system, and the system then readapts itself to the values of the community. Do we see that in business? Of course. Do we see it in politics? Of course. Look at the gender debate in society and things like the same-sex marriage. For a long time, that was not acceptable. Then there is a tension within society. Builds. And there comes a point where a decision needs to be made. And that's the point of tension, where suddenly the things are close enough that the interaction is totally unavoidable, that the tension is there and cannot be escaped. And then disruption happens and adaptation comes in. And that adaptive quality is something, of course, that has been pointed out in physics and also in complexity theory, because whenever we've got all those elements working together, it's totally unpredictable, except for one thing: we know it's going to change. And we see that historically. Back to questioning builds away. All ways of thinking, more or less perceptible, lead through language in a manner that is extraordinary. What do people think of that statement?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that, Pierre. Could you repeat the statement?
The one here? One that on the screen?
No, the one you just mentioned, asking for a comment.
It is on the screen, Holly.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Holly may have a problem there for some reason. Don't you see the text on the screen?
I do. And this is so interesting. I put in chat, have any of you read that Kahneman book about thinking fast and slow? It's almost like a very well-reasoned rebuttal to the Malcolm, what's his name, Blink, saying always trust your intuition, which frankly, I disagree with.
Only you just mentioned the chat. When I share, I cannot see the chat. But one thing that is important, by the way, I suspect that some people may use the chat in Zoom. When we record, the chat gets recorded as well. And I suggest to David that we put comments that are in the chat, that we put them, make them available as well.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I enjoy learning about thinking and the way the brain works. And I just wanted to recommend that book. And I saw Derek shaking his head, or Neville, I forget, somebody read it anyhow. Did you like it?
Derek has his hand up as well. And Neville?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So asking for responses to this statement. Questioning builds away. Yeah, it's almost a tautology, right? What strikes me is it leads to something that is, extraordinary. Why is that? There's the possibilities there. There's the extraordinary is always a potential, but I'd like to know more about that.
One of the points there, and it's a point associated with semiotics more than it is directly with complexity. What Heidegger points out is that when we question or when we do anything, ways of thinking, when it's perceptible, it's associated to science. That means that the language, the science, the perception leads to that extraordinary is extraordinary. The fact that we can make sense of things, the fact that we can question things, the fact that we can change things, everything happens through some form of language in a very general term. Again, the term language here is not the best possible translation. It is that kind of the signs, the things that we perceive, and the things that we create as signs that are extraordinary, that we can make sense of them. Because when you think about it, and that is one of the points that Derrida makes, which is why Heidegger and Derrida got along quite well ideologically along the lines of semiotics, is that how is it possible that we can make sense of what is simply by looking at the language of perception? It's extraordinary because we don't really have direct access to what things are. We have access to how we perceive things. And at the same time, we know that that existence is there. And we interact all the time. But there is always a distance. And yet, no matter that distance, it always makes sense. If it is perceptible, make sense of it. That's the extraordinary that Heidegger refers to. It leads through language in a manner that is extraordinary.
Neville has his hand up.
Pierre, are you aware of Wayne Hudson's edited book with the book chapter? The book was called After Habermas.
After Habermas, yes.
Yeah. And Wayne there, who's a colleague of mine, who, in the field of intellectual history. So that's sort of where I'm primary based, but I bring, that multidiscipline factors in terms of sociology, philosophy, geography, and educational theory into the thinking in Australian intellectual history. And it's Wayne that's really my mentor in this regard. And so his chapter was on the mundane. I mean, the value of the mundane. So again, there doesn't seem to be a necessary binary here, even just reading the way that the sentence in English has been put together, and perhaps the German would be better. But it seems to me you can't have the mundane if there isn't an extraordinary process, and you can't have something that's extraordinary unless there is mundane habits. I mean, they need each other to make any sense, any meaning.
Yeah, and there are a couple of points there. I'm not familiar with that book, but I'm familiar with Habermas. I'm also familiar with Lefebvre, and that is the point that Habermas really analyzes that in great detail. And then Lefebvre uses that in his theory of the everyday. So Lefebvre, everything is in the everyday. So everything is mundane in a certain way. It's unescapable. And his theory, of course, Lefebvre's theory is then closely associated with social change. And again, he's one of those writers of the second part of the 20th century in France, very influential on the everyday, because he puts the everyday as at the center of the intellectual process. There was something else that you were mentioning. We'll come back.
Okay, Ocean, it's your turn.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Yep.
Oh, good. Yeah, actually, I have to confess, I joined 1 hour late. I I didn't realize that there was a time change. So I missed the presentation, but I really like what you just said about it's all about our perception. It's not about actual reality. And that reminded me, one of my philosophical professors, told me that asked the students a question, who wrote the Macbeth? And everybody said, oh, it was Shakespeare. No, it's you, because Shakespeare doesn't spoon feed what he really wanted to say. It's all our interpretation determines the meaning or how great the piece of the novel was. So the same token, who wrote the Mozart symphony? It's not a Mozart, but it's how perceptive or what kind of a great background knowledge you have determines the quality of the music. It's not the music itself. So it's all about our perception. But just a simple question: when you say extraordinary, it's a little too abstract for me. Give us an example. Give us an example of what's extraordinary and what's mundane. I'm just curious, at the personal level. Thanks a lot.
Well, I certainly, it's something that I was referring to earlier as well. What I find extraordinary, which is actually what Heidegger refers to, is that if we look at the mundane, what we make sense of is our perception of the mundane. The perception of anything that happens around us. It's extraordinary because we don't really understand everything that sits behind it, yet we can make sense enough to survive. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. We are here making sense of the world around us through the perception of signs that are not really what the sign. It's not the sign that we interact with. We base ourselves on that extraordinary possibility, capacity that we've got to interpret the perception, to make sense of something that is not accessible directly. I find that absolutely extraordinary. And that's in the mundane. That's every day. There is no escaping them. One point and the point that I was going to make based on what Neville was saying, which actually links to the concept of extraordinary in the everyday, is that what we consider to be generally extraordinary, and like the point that Ocean makes about Shakespeare. I've always been involved in community arts and community writing and community work in general. And you've got people saying, oh, well, yes, but that's... And I had actually an instance like that in the community writers group in Ireland, of all places, where a relatively famous writer, who will remain nameless, said, oh, all that is bullshit. So he was referring to what people were writing, the everyday writing practice. And I simply made the point, I said, you only know about the people that are writers like Shakespeare because there's all the other writers. Shakespeare cannot exist outside of the context of literature in general, including the people that write on the everyday. And it's in that context that we make sense. And that is where also we make sense of something like Shakespeare based on our understanding of the language of the everyday that we use. And the same is true in any kind of situation. When people say that is extraordinary, what's extraordinary is that we can actually look at something and say, I prefer that because I think it's better, but it can only be better because the other is there as well. And every single element that we put in there enriches us because of that. No matter how much value we attach or other people attach to things, without that kind of environment that we create all the time, without that mundane that we create all the time, nothing else would exist. And it's actually...
Could I quickly chime in? So that reminded me of one of my first gurus, a famous author named Ram Dass, who wrote To Be Here Now. He's the Harvard professor of psychology, and he wrote a book. He wrote many books. I'm a big fan of it, and one of which is how the drug, like a magic mushroom and LSD, had changed his consciousness. And at one point, he described that when he took the LSD or those magic mushroom, your consciousness, level of the consciousness, is so expanded, like a divine level, that even looking at the spill of Coca-Cola, it start to see the entirety of the universe. It's how your perception gets so huge that looking at the mundane things like a spill of a Coca-Cola, you start to see the secret of the universe. So that kind of reminded me of that. Thanks a lot.
Let's go. Let's try something else. I even like using, like when you go to teach at university, one of the rules was you cannot use Wikipedia. Why not? It's there. It's how we make sense of it that matters. It's, again, a tool, right? So one of the things that I did was search on existentialism and did it in Wikipedia. Kierkegaard advocated rationality as a means to interact with the objective world, but when it comes to existential problems, reason is insufficient. Human reason has boundaries. Let me add something that I think is my interpretation, which is actually my interpretation also of Kant. When Kant looks at reason, he argues that reason is something that we need to question. And for a very simple reason, is that reason is an endeavor that we have. We cannot say that life is reasonable. We simply try to use reason in order to make sense of it. Reason is part of life. It doesn't sit above it. And so human reason has boundaries. It's the boundaries of our understanding. Reason is part of that. It doesn't sit on the outside. So what do people think of that?
Hush has got his hand raised. Go ahead, Tush.
Hi. I was just wanting to comment on the idea of objective reality in general, and the idea that you can be purely objective at all by using reason, like just rationality, because the way the actual mind functions is the subjective I in relation to the objective. I think feelings are actually attached to any way you judge a situation, even if you're not conscious of them, and that your pre-experiences, your biases, the way you view things, the way you interpret things always come into your experience of objective reality. So I don't know if there is really such a thing, and that's maybe pointing out why reason has boundaries, because it is intimately linked with the fallibility of human experience.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even call it fallibility. I think it is simply a fact. And obviously, I've got a problem with some of that statement. I don't believe in that objective world as such. Again, it's the kind of, we base ourselves on perception. And so the reasoning, and the rationales that we develop are based on that perception. So if we look, for instance, at the universe, we say that we understand it, but what we understand is what we perceive of it. And if we look at the history of science, whenever then we find another way of looking at it, it questions the objectivity that was before and says, oh yeah, but this is not exactly the way it is. What we then need to do, I think, in terms of questioning, is to recognize that the way that we interpret it now is based on the limits of our reason to understand what is really there, because we haven't seen everything yet, and we'll never will. And so that objective reality is totally unreachable in a certain way. But the strange thing, and it's back to that concept of the extraordinary, we can make sense of things enough to live, to exist. And at the same time, we never have that, what we could call a complete knowledge, because that knowledge is the reasons within boundaries, which is actually the point I think that Tash is making.
Neville, it's your turn.
Thank you. I see the boundaries, and I write about this as systems thought. So, and the way that I articulate it is in terms of intellectual history or philosophical history, in terms of that we no longer sort of, I think, operate, if we ever did, in terms of nice tidy boxes of block type of ideologies or systems thought. And I think one of the big fundamental problems, I think, in the 20th century, philosophical problems in the 20th century, applied philosophical, social philosophy in the 20th century, was this attitude in perhaps the third wave of early 20th century, third wave of positivism that came about in the early 20th century, I suppose in the form of behavioralism. And so what the mistake, I think, the fundamental error there was to say, well, we don't want idealism. You know, idealism's failed. Germanic idealism, Hegel, you know, even Dilthey, the history in terms of historicism, you know, that you know, it's not about ideals, it's about reality. And so politically, theologically, socially, we had these movements of realism, theological realism, political realism, you know, social realism. And the problem was not to understand what an ideal is and what we are talking about when we refer to an object. And of course, those questions then, you know, Heidegger, you know, through to Derrida, you know, sort of had developed, I think, a move towards breaking this sort of false dichotomy, you know, between, you know, one side's right, one side's wrong. You know, idealism is all wrong, realism is all wrong. It's a constructed false narrative. And we've got to see that, you know, that contemporary philosophers, well, 20th century philosophers, you know, from Wittgenstein onwards, and, you know, and I'm talking about early Wittgenstein, you know, there was a capacity to think about these questions less ideologically, that is, in terms of a, you know, nice and neat box of systems thought. And so what I'm doing in the history, in terms of scoping to Queensland, I'm actually demonstrating there's a hidden history there where a lot of those threads and the way that people live, ordinary people in the mundane, all those threads sort of interacted. And the trouble is that it sort of got entangled and people didn't really sort of understand the co-relationships between various ways of thinking about ways of life. I don't know. I hope I probably haven't explained that very well, but maybe Pierre might be able to illuminate.
Well, one of the issues that we face is that concept of the worldview. And there is that kind of image where we say the worldview is like asking a fish what it is to have water. We are in it. So it's only when it changes that we perceive that there was something there. One of the problems that we have is that the worldview creates perspectives. And when we are in the everyday, and particularly when we talk about things that we believe are reasonable, what we're actually doing is putting a perspective out there. And very often what happens is that you may have people that say, well, that's not reasonable. What they don't see is that their perspective is simply different than the perspective of somebody else, but they're actually talking about exactly the same thing. So the problem is in the language, which is when that extraordinary capacity of the language and communication falls down, not because the language falls down, but because of the interpretation and the lack of understanding of perspective. And perspective is the reality. It's not even rational. Which is, again, something that I find really interesting about all that. And it's amazing that we, again, it's amazing that we can still make sense in that context and that we can live together in something that is manageable.
Stephen, your turn.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Ah, good, I'm coming through. Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think rationality is a concept that's understood that well anymore. I hear people referring to reason and rationality all the time, and I think they fail to comprehend that rationalism is built upon foundational ideas. They don't understand this. They think that the foundational ideas that humanity experiences are somehow absolute universals. And I would try and remind them that the universe is a very, very big place these days. And for, this humanity, which are these apes that fell out of a tree, to think that their foundational ideas are the absolute ideas of the universe is apt to be in error. But I think Nietzsche is an example of this. Nietzsche, when you look at Nietzsche as a young man, he started out as sort of an idealistic rationalist person, like we all do. He was looking for a set of values to live by, and he starts off as an idealist, and then he discovers, ideals are a bit lacking, and then he becomes a rationalist. I'll try and find the more foundational ideas, and then he discovers they're not good enough either. I have to find ideas that are based purely on reality, not actually reality, but physics. I've got to find, our base stratum as ape creatures, as animal creatures. Only in the instincts will I find the truth. And I don't think that quite worked for him either. And he went in a 180-degree turn. And the interesting thing is he started to seek understandings connected with the ideas of Leibniz. Leibniz taught us about dynamism. And the other thing Leibniz taught was monadism. When you look at Nietzsche's perceptualism, it's very much like Leibniz's monadism. And so I'm stuck here. Rationality is pretty easy to understand, except very few understand it. But Nietzsche's perceptionism is this sort of monism, how the universe changes when we look at it from a different angle. Now, the high priests of rationalism are always trying to tell us, no, there is just one set of universal truths, and us, the particular ape creatures that fell out of the trees, we understand them. We know what they are. We are as big as the universe. And this seems to be where we are today. Thank you.
Yes, and that, of course, is where the question is. the importance of questioning rather than that kind of absolute. And it's actually a point also that was made by Charles Sanders Peirce in his foundation of pragmatism and the way that he looked at things and said, it's like the rules, like the rationales that we've got are only valid as long as there's not an exception. And he makes the point that we can never guarantee any absolute. It's simply because we may not have seen the exception to what we believe is a rule. And so we always need to have that kind of very pragmatic questioning. And actually that goes back to also, we can go back philosophically. I would go back there to Plato and Socrates, of course, we only know them through Plato. One of the things that I find interesting in what is the politics, first of all, Plato was not referring to the Republic, because Republic is a Latin concept, res publica. What Plato refers to is politeia, the management of society. But one of the things that people don't really get when they look at politeia and the dialogues is that Plato questions all this. And in his first dialogue, where he demonstrates that it's more important to have a philosophy that is based on duty rather than expediency, rather than the end justifies the means. He comes to the point where in the end, the antagonist to Socrates agrees with that. But the last sentence in that first dialogue, Plato says, yeah, but you seem to forget one thing, is that you now agree with me. The only way that we could come to that agreement is because of the starting points that we used. And so what he does, he questions the whole thing. He questions the whole rationality of the thing. Which when you think about it, that's all those thousands of years ago. There is somebody who has the intelligence of doing that questioning. And we need to go back to that question all the time. Which is, of course, the point that was made earlier with Heidegger. Questioning is the piety of thought.
Muri, it's your turn.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic.
We've lost you, Muri. Or perhaps we can go to Ocean in the meantime.
Yep.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting. Everybody's asking very interesting, intriguing questions. They're very beneficial. Anyways, so there was maybe 20 minutes ago, one lady mentioned about how she was questioning about the objectivity. There's such a thing as perfect objectivity as opposed to subjectivity. And some other lady mentioned 25 minutes ago about the nuclear bomb. That's very interesting. So I'll spell out my definition of rationality, and you can respond to me. So base rationality is extremely powerful tools that only human has, that no other species have. Like a perfect example, and objectivity. So, okay, two things. If you question about the objectivity, if somebody stabs you and you see the blood is coming out from your body, that's objectivity. It's not subjectivity. You can't delude yourself that, oh, there's no blood. If you don't treat it, you're going to die sooner or later. That's perfect objectivity. There's no way around. Second, my definition of rationality is you can predict the result. That's the spirit of the whole thousands of years of the spirit of the Western scientific mind. The best example is we send astronauts to the moon, and based on the Newtonian physics, we calculated exactly how to maneuver the outer space, and we have successfully make them come back to the Earth. It's calculation. and we can predict the result, and precisely, exactly, no way around. So that proves the important existence of objectivity and rationality. End of the story. There's no way, no other ways to interpret what I just said. So if you were going to refute what I just said, I'll be curious to know. Thanks a lot.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, just the point about the objectivity is based on what we understand. And so the thing is that because there is no understanding of the absolute, our objectivity, and it's again back to the thing that it's extraordinary that even with the limits of our understanding, we can achieve what we achieve. That doesn't mean that there is not a subjective component. That's the point simply that I think is important to make. Now that requires a much longer conversation as well, my friends. But what I find interesting in the context of this discussion is that we've got those different perspectives that are coming to mind. And again, what I think is really critical, and it's something that is linked to the concept of multidisciplinary and multiple thinking, is we need to go back as a society to the ability to have all those ideas coming to the fore as we do here, and then try to make sense of them. And the interesting thing is that we can make sense of them, even when there are contradictions from one statement to another, just as there are contradictions in the statements that we see on the screen. So those contradictions are not saying that there is not something to make sense with. No, on the contrary, we can still make sense of it, even when we've got that kind of paradox where objectivity seems to be objective, where actually it may not be. Questioning. Right? Again, back to questioning. And I noticed that Murray is back.
Yeah, oh, yes, thank you very much. Sorry, the internet threw me out. Should I go over my question again?
Yes, of course, yes.
Okay, thank you. I was trying to say that I'm a bit curious to know personally how this objective view you just explained aids or facilitates decision making, decision taking, or in forming of opinion generally. That's one part of the question. Then the second part is I've seen situations where it's very imperative to remain subjective in order to maintain smooth ethical relationship. For example, in marital relationship and in official job setting, how can one, with this existentialist view of complexity, operate successfully in these environments? Thank you very much.
Well, the key is actually when you say the question in this environment, when we are in an environment, no matter if we call that objective or subjective, that's irrelevant in a way. One of the essential points that is at the essence of pragmatism and semiotics, which is Charles Sanders Peirce, is that we always make sense based on the signs that we receive. And we always react to those signs. And in the reaction to those signs, the interesting thing is that that triggers a change. And it will always trigger a change because there is the other side that will perceive those signs and then do something with it. What's interesting is that most of the time that works. And so I would even go beyond the concept of objective and subjective, is that we cannot escape the fact that we react based on signs, and that is by sending out other signs that things are changing. And the amazing thing, back to Heidegger, is that because we do that through science, it's extraordinary that it actually works. That in itself is a question of that's beside. Does that make sense, Murray? Murray, does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Tash, go
Yes.
ahead.
Yes, Tash.
Yeah, just commenting, I think it was Ocean that was talking about
Yeah.
rationality and the example of being, I think it was stabbed. For me, that's talking about the objective. And you can say, but that's a reductive way of seeing the whole situation. There's a lens through which we view that. So it's how bad does someone feel like someone's being, that they're bleeding, and what the damage is, and the context of it is where the psychology comes in, and the emotional investment in those sort of so-called objective realities of whatever it is actually influence how you see the objective world. And that brings the subjective into relation, because we're always in relation as people. And I think that's about existentialism, is about the different ways, you know, we can interpret, and the possibilities of seeing the world based on the inferences we make, and that there's more than one way, and that this rationality for me is always, as you, I think, you know, that the way that Pierre was always saying that it's always in relationship to other, you know, we're always in relationship to other in the world, and that's just how I view rationality. It's the natural science, what you actually choose to study and how you study is based on how you invest and feel about certain things. So that's all I was commenting. Yeah, so thanks.
Thank you. Can I just chime in? Can I just quickly respond? Thank you so much.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. And I agree with you, except, you know, some lady talked about, let's say, nuclear bomb, right? And let's say nuclear bomb killed 200,000 people. And that's the objective fact. You know, you can't, if you take the LSD strong enough, then you delude yourself and, oh, there's nobody died, or, you know, but you can't count the number of the body, or people who died in the Holocaust, you know, count the bodies. And you can't do really, I mean, unless if your brain is functional, you can't count the body, and that's the objective fact. And of course, you can subjectively delude yourself, but there are certain objective fact. You can't deny it if your brain is, decently functional. And what do you say to that?
The thing
Well,
is that, go ahead, Tash. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that it's still the way in which you view the bomb is subjective. So the fact is always in relationship to the subjective. So it's like, yes, you can deny facts, but beyond that, the way you see a bomb falling, the way that you see it explode, that you can see it through a perspective of being completely detached and try and see it in a way objectively, but that's still a relationship to it and a way of interpreting it through like just through like trying to look at it through science. It's actually about a relationship that relates to the way you see things, is if that makes sense.
Yeah, can I just,
it's still,
let's not go too much along those lines, because we're going to come to opposing perspectives. One point that I would like to make here is that there is a difference in between recognizing objectively something that we perceive and the objectivity of what sits behind it. And that is where the perspective issue comes in. So if I get stabbed, to me that is an objective fact. But is it a fact objective beyond that which I feel and live, which is a philosophical question. And I think we occasionally try to confuse the two. And that is where we need to be a bit careful. But that's a conversation in itself. Obviously, we react based on things that we perceive on the basis of the fact that we must assume that they are factual, even if they're not. And we do that all the time. Unfortunately, most of the time, it works. No matter what the reality behind those facts may or may not be. which is an existential question. That's a different thing altogether. Now, what I
Yeah, can I quickly chime in? Yeah. Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So, but yeah, but I have many dear Jewish friends. They lost. Actually, I mean, it's not a subjective thing, but objectively, conclusively, lost their siblings. In the gas chamber during the Holocaust. So I personally believe that objectively many Jews are killed, but if you start saying that, oh, it's subjectively on a deeper level it never happened, and I don't know, I would agree with that. I'm staying in the position that yeah, you can't count how many Jews were killed in the camps, an absolute and complete and objective sense, and I'm not sure I can there's no other way to interpret that.
no, but
I just have to say, in my defence, I do believe there are objective things that happen. I'm just saying they're in relationship to the subjective. I don't want myself to be misunderstood because I don't want to be aligned with Holocaust deniers. I'm just saying that there are people out there that interpret that in a way that I would not interpret it. Like, obviously, that's the most horrendous thing, and I'm just saying there's not a purely objective world, in the sense of that there are objective things, but they come in relationship. That's all I'm saying. Thanks.
Yeah, it's two ways of looking at things. One has to do with the things that we perceive, and we've got to assume that they're objective. And the point that Tash is making, I think, which is the point, I would phrase that as saying we have no possibility of understanding of the actual objectivity that sits behind everything. That doesn't mean that things don't happen, right? So, and we can come up with all sorts of examples of our life. We react to things because we know that they're there. But what the objectivity behind that is, it's a bit like saying, going to give an example a bit before we go. One of the things that I was lucky enough to do in my life is to be a pilot. So I can fly aircraft. And I was doing formation flying. In a certain way, that is rational, because you need to fly with other people. So you need to know how an aircraft is going to react, and you need to have communication where you know that there's no possibility of misinterpretation, right? Because if there's misinterpretation, the aircraft are going to hit each other, you're going to fall out of the sky. Right? Objective reality. And indeed, in one instance, one of the pilots misunderstood the sign and tried to take leadership of the formation when actually was not the time to do it. And so I had to react straight away, which is a rational fact, and make sure that there was no accident. That is an objectivity of our perception of what happens. Where there is a difference is that if we then look objectively at the interpretation of the world in which we live and say, what is the objectivity that states that aircraft work exactly the way that they do because we understand how they work? That is a step that we cannot make in absolute terms. We know that the thing is supposed to work like that, and we can live with that. But the reality that sits behind it, that is something that we cannot understand objectively. I don't know if that makes sense. So everyday life, the everyday, we base it on our interpretation of the things that happen around us. That is objective in a way. Because if we simply treat it subjectively and say, oh, no, that won't work. Oh, no, of course it's not. And I don't know if all that makes sense. One thing that I would suggest we do, quickly go for another one just in case.
Conrad has his hand up.
Yeah, I just had a question in terms of this objectivity and reason. Where does meaning fit into all of this? Because it seems to me that what humans are really wanting and needing is meaning, and then we use reason to get meaning yeah, just wondering what you think about that, and then how that relates to emotion. So you got reason, you got meaning, and then you got emotion.
The meaning is the averaging of our interpretations of what we see. It's always going to happen. It's the point that Frankl makes as well. It's impossible to have experience without making meaning of it, some form of meaning. And that is a form of rational process. And at the same time, we cannot do it outside of our emotional being. So, and that is where the concept of objectivity and subjectivity becomes.
But isn't the goal of the reason that we follow rationality and reason is to produce meaning? Like ultimately, we're not interested in reason; we're interested in meaning, because meaning is what gives us emotions.
Yeah, but that's exactly the point. That's right. And it's the point that Frankl, who's a psychiatrist, makes. And he says, no matter what experience we're going through, in the end, what we're going to do is make meaning out of it.
Thank you.
Right? And I think that is very important.
Yeah. Muri, you've got your hand up. Muri? You're muted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you very much. It's just a fallback to my previous question. Let me use myself as an example. Currently, I'm speaking to you from Nigeria, and in my house, we took in an old, blind, homeless woman. We took her in, and she's been living with us for 2 years now. We are practically the one taking care of her, and we are happy with her. But the issue is, each time my friends visit me, they pass comments that are really discouraging, discouraging me from helping her. And honestly, I find it, uncomplimentary, as if, my effort is not being appreciated somehow. So my question is, at what time do we give consideration to pressuring objective views? When do we consider processing such advice or counseling? When do we turn them down? Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's not a matter of turning down. It comes back to some of the other things that we were just saying as well. It's important to realize that we've got to construct that meaning. And that meaning is based on the rational process, which is the process of questioning it. It's not simply accepting what people say. It's deconstructing what they say and accepting. You make a point that let me just try to put the cat away. Sorry about that. Got a very big cat and tends to come in and interfere with things. The point that you're making reminded me of something. I had a student that I was teaching at Murdoch University, and she came from an African country, not Nigeria. Her husband had been killed, her father had been killed, and her children were going to be killed. And she managed to escape with 5 children. And she came as a refugee to Perth. And she was studying social sciences, and she took my unit on semiotics. And we became good friends. And initially, she actually failed. She couldn't really reconcile some of the concepts that we were dealing with. But she really got interested in that process of interpretation of what happens in reality in order to construct meaning and make sense of things, and then use that. And so what she did, she came back, and then in conversations and in her projects, she started to look at the fact that one of the points that had never been made to her, that came out in the conversation using, that interpretation of science, is that she could only be a victim because people wanted her to be a victim because she was actually endangering them as well. That means you cannot go outside of a situation in society without having those conflicts. People are caught in those conflicts because the conflict exists. As soon as Kadia, and if her name away now, as soon as she understood that, everything started to make sense. The good news is that not only did she succeed very well, my unit, but she then used that deconstruction ability to look at all the social science work that she was doing, and she became a consultant for refugees. And so, but she did it because of the questioning and the ability to then put things in context again. It's that thing again, in context. Nothing exists outside of context. There is no such a thing as an absolute. So when you've got people coming in and making those statements, you can say, just question the statement. Deconstruct your own statement. And that works, by the way.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate this. Thank you.
So, David, what do you think? David, you're unmute.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what I think. What are you asking?
No, one thing that I would suggest, we're not going to go on forever and ever and always. So I've got quite a few of those quotes. And one thing in the presentation, I'm going to include all those, a set of quotes at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. I will make that available through you, everyone. And as we mentioned earlier, if there's anything in the chat, you can actually send me, if I've got access to the chat, I will put that in the presentation PowerPoint. And then I will also give, well, people have my email, right? So people can communicate with me. So there is no reason to stop the conversation now. You can keep on the conversation going.
Perhaps you should put your email in the chat, Pierre.
Well, I can stop share. So stop share.
Well, if you'll finish your presentation, Pierre, perhaps we can open it up for questions, comments, and discussion with everybody.
Everybody can see my email on the chat. And I will, it is on the presentation as well, I think.
Well, let me thank you, Dr. Pierre van Osselaer, for your presentation on the existential value of complexity. And with that, we'll stop the recording and throw the meeting open to questions, comments, and discussion.